Judge Edward Morris sat at his elevated desk, reviewing the case file in front of him. His courtroom, a small but efficient space, was filled with the hum of whispered conversations as the next case was called. His stern gaze scanned the defendant, Amina Johnson, who stood at the front of the room with an air of quiet confidence. Amina, a field biologist in her early 30s, was dressed simply in a professional blouse and khakis, her natural hair pulled back into a neat bun. She seemed out of place in a room full of lawyers, defendants, and court officers, yet she remained composed, her eyes never wavering from the judge's face. Judge Morris had seen many cases involving environmental issues, but none that stood out like this one. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Morris said, his voice cutting through the murmur in the room, "you are charged with a violation of local environmental regulations. According to the report, your actions resulted in the disturbance of a protected wildlife area. How do you plead?" Amina didn't immediately respond, instead taking a moment to gather her thoughts, her gaze focused on the judge. She had anticipated this moment, the routine questioning that most defendants were met with, followed by a penalty and a swift exit. She had been in enough legal battles before to know that bureaucracy rarely cared for the nuances of her work, but Amina was used to being underestimated. "I don't contest the fine, Your Honor," Amina said calmly, "but I do wish to explain the context, if you'll allow me." Judge Morris raised an eyebrow. His job was not to listen to justifications. His job was to make decisions based on facts, and he was already familiar with the details of the case. Still, he motioned for her to proceed. Amina spoke softly, but with an undeniable clarity. She explained that the actions which led to the fine were part of a much larger conservation initiative aimed at protecting endangered species in the region. "I was working to track the migration patterns of the endangered river otters," she said, her eyes steady on the judge's. "Their habitat is in critical danger from industrial development. In some cases, the environmental regulations on the books do not fully protect the land or wildlife. I've been trying to fill that gap by collecting crucial data to advocate for stronger protections." The judge listened, though his expression didn't change. He had heard similar stories before, activists and experts who spoke passionately about their causes, but he had never been one to be easily swayed by emotional appeals. His focus was on the law. Still, there was something in Amina's words that lingered. She wasn't just an environmentalist. She spoke with authority, like someone who understood the science, the politics, and the broader implications of her work. "Is there something about your work," the judge asked, his tone more inquisitive than before, "that would suggest this disturbance wasn't just a mistake?" Amina paused, choosing her words carefully. "What you might see as a disturbance, Your Honor, is part of a broader effort to reshape federal wildlife protections. My work is contributing to research that could lead to new policies. This is bigger than one incident, and I believe it is part of the change that's needed." The courtroom fell silent for a moment. The judge's gaze softened, though his mind was racing. He knew that this case wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Judge Morris leaned back in his chair, the weight of Amina's words hanging in the air. He had heard arguments before, but something about this case felt different. There was a quiet force behind Amina's explanation that made him question his initial judgment. Was it possible that this wasn't just a simple regulatory violation? Could this woman standing before him truly be on the verge of changing something much larger? "Ms. Johnson," Judge Morris said, his voice softer now but still firm, "I understand that you feel strongly about the importance of your work. But rules are rules. The law exists to maintain order, to ensure that everyone, regardless of their beliefs, follows the same standards. You can't just ignore them because you think a cause is greater." Amina nodded, acknowledging his point, but her demeanor remained composed. "I'm not ignoring the law, Your Honor. I'm asking for it to evolve. The regulations in place were made decades ago, and they don't fully address the realities of modern conservation. What I'm doing may seem like a disturbance to the system, but I'm only trying to prevent greater harm." Judge Morris took a long breath, his fingers drumming on the desk as he weighed her words. The familiar structure of his world, the predictable outcomes of legal decisions, the certainty of precedent, felt suddenly inadequate in the face of Amina's conviction. He thought back to the past few days, where he had reviewed the case file. The environmental agency had filed the complaint, but the evidence seemed flimsy. Amina's actions, though seemingly small, had been in defense of something much bigger. He couldn't deny the passion she carried in her voice, nor could he ignore the growing feeling that this case was more complex than it first appeared. "Why should I believe that your actions are more than just personal opinion?" he asked, suddenly unsure of his own judgment. "Why should I let this go? The law is clear about what's allowed and what's not." Amina's eyes sharpened. She wasn't rattled. "Because, Your Honor, the law is supposed to protect the public good. And right now, it's failing to protect the very things we depend on. The animals, the ecosystems, the future generations. The law needs to evolve to meet those needs." Judge Morris paused, the weight of her words pressing on him. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain about his decisions, but something in Amina's unflinching certainty was challenging his assumptions. The fine he had been prepared to issue now seemed like a small, insignificant part of a much larger conversation. After a long silence, Judge Morris finally spoke. "I'll have to consider this more carefully. You'll hear from me soon, Ms. Johnson." His tone was no longer that of a man issuing a standard ruling, but of someone grappling with a deeper issue, one that went beyond the courtroom. As Amina turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the judge's face, a mix of curiosity and doubt. For the first time, she felt as though her work was being seen for what it truly was, an urgent mission for change. After the court session, Judge Morris returned to his chambers, his mind swirling with Amina's words. He couldn't remember the last time a case had left him so unsettled. As a judge, he had spent years enforcing laws that were designed to keep order, but Amina had introduced him to an entirely different perspective, one that questioned the very laws he had been upholding. He hadn't anticipated this, and it left him feeling both intrigued and uneasy. Unable to shake the feeling that he'd missed something important, Morris decided to delve deeper. He instructed his clerk to gather more information on Amina Johnson. If he was going to consider her arguments seriously, he needed to understand more about the person standing before him. By the end of the day, Morris had a stack of research on his desk. Amina's resume, a list of her published works, news articles about her conservation efforts, and references to her collaborations with various wildlife organizations. His fingers traced over the words as he read through her background. Amina Johnson wasn't just a passionate environmentalist. She was an accomplished biologist, respected by her peers, and deeply involved in shaping policy at both the state and federal levels. Her efforts had led to the development of new strategies for preserving wildlife habitats, especially in areas vulnerable to overdevelopment. What struck Morris the most was her involvement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where she had worked alongside federal officials to address the gaps in the nation's wildlife protections. Amina had been part of the team advocating for the expansion of conservation zones and the stricter enforcement of regulations on endangered species. She was also working on legislation to include climate change in the national conversation on wildlife management, a topic Morris had never even considered in his rulings. The more Morris read, the clearer it became that Amina was at the forefront of a movement, one that aimed to radically shift the way federal laws treated the environment. Her research and activism were creating ripple effects across the country, challenging the status quo and pushing for a new approach to conservation that balanced scientific data with real-world action. It was no longer just a case of a fine being imposed for a minor breach. Amina was playing a role in something much larger than any courtroom could contain. Morris knew he had to understand this more fully. He needed to see beyond the surface of the case and consider the broader implications of the work Amina was doing. For the first time in a long while, the judge was unsure of the right course of action. Was the fine really the right response to someone who might be reshaping the very laws he had sworn to uphold? The questions were too important to ignore. Judge Morris sat in his office late into the evening, a fresh cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he continued his research. The stack of papers in front of him was growing, and with each new document, he uncovered more about Amina Johnson's influence in the world of conservation. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that Amina was far more than a biologist simply working in a protected wildlife area. She was a key figure in a growing movement that was reshaping the future of environmental protection in the United States. It became clear that Amina had been at the heart of a critical shift in federal wildlife protection policies. Her work on endangered species conservation wasn't just scientific, it was political. She had been instrumental in pushing for new wildlife protection guidelines that acknowledged the challenges of climate change, land development, and habitat destruction in ways traditional laws had not. The outdated regulations, which Judge Morris had upheld without question for so long, were suddenly exposed as inadequate in the face of modern threats to ecosystems. The more Morris read, the more he began to question his assumptions about the law. How could policies created decades ago possibly address the environmental realities of today? Was the system he had worked within for so long failing to protect the very thing it was supposed to, nature itself? He could no longer see Amina's actions as a mere misstep or violation of the law. She was fighting for something far more urgent and necessary. Morris had always prided himself on being a stickler for the letter of the law, but now he was confronted with the realization that the law, as it stood, was a poor tool for solving the pressing issues of today. Amina's advocacy for updating those laws, her challenge to what he had always considered the system, wasn't just a call for change, it was a call for survival. One article in particular caught his eye. It detailed how Amina had worked alongside lawmakers to introduce bills that would protect wildlife corridors, those essential stretches of land that allowed animals to migrate and breed safely across larger territories. Her research had proven that the loss of these corridors had led to severe declines in animal populations, yet the law had remained stagnant, unable to address the issue. Morris now saw the fine he had been preparing to impose as trivial in comparison to the broader context of Amina's work. She wasn't just fighting to protect a single piece of land or species. She was challenging a system that was failing on a much larger scale. The judge felt a growing sense of discomfort as the true significance of his role in this situation became clearer. Was he about to uphold an outdated regulation that stood in the way of progress? The question gnawed at him. Amina was reshaping the landscape of wildlife protection, and in doing so, perhaps she was also reshaping the law itself. The weight of the decision he now faced was becoming more complex than any case he had encountered before. A few days after his deep dive into Amina Johnson's work, Judge Morris found himself pacing the courtroom, unable to shake the feeling that this case was far from typical. His initial reaction, of swiftly issuing a fine, now seemed hasty and in some ways short-sighted. Amina's argument about updating the law to protect the environment had struck a chord with him, and the more he reflected on it, the more he realized he needed to understand her better. The decision to reach out to her was uncharacteristic, but something about this case felt like it demanded more than just legal rulings. Judge Morris didn't know exactly what he hoped to gain from a conversation with Amina, but he knew that he could no longer simply ignore the larger implications of her work. A few hours later, his secretary arranged for a meeting at Amina's office, an unassuming building nestled on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense forest. When Morris arrived, Amina greeted him with a warm, measured smile. There was no trace of animosity in her demeanor, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Instead, she seemed genuinely curious about the judge's sudden interest in her work. "Thank you for meeting with me," Judge Morris began, settling into a chair across from Amina's cluttered desk. "I've had a chance to review some of your research, and I'll admit, I wasn't fully aware of the scale of what you're doing. It's impressive." Amina smiled, but her expression remained focused. "Thank you, Your Honor. But what I'm doing isn't about recognition. It's about ensuring the survival of species and ecosystems that are on the brink of being lost forever. I'm pushing for more than just laws on paper. I'm advocating for real change." Morris nodded, intrigued by the quiet intensity in her words. "I read about your work with wildlife corridors and the legislative efforts you've been involved in. It seems like what you're proposing goes against some established policies that have been in place for years." Amina's eyes sharpened. "That's exactly it. The laws we have now were written when the challenges we face were completely different. We have more advanced scientific understanding today. I'm not trying to break the law, but to get it to evolve with the times. Nature doesn't wait for us to catch up." Judge Morris shifted in his seat, feeling his initial skepticism begin to melt away. He had assumed that Amina's work was simply an attempt to sidestep the rules, but now he saw the larger vision. This wasn't about breaking the law. It was about working to rewrite it in a way that would protect the world for future generations. As the conversation continued, Amina shared more about her efforts to influence national policy, and Morris found himself drawn in by her passion. She spoke not just with knowledge, but with a deep personal commitment to her cause. It was impossible not to feel the weight of her determination, and the judge began to wonder, was his decision to fine her just a small part of a much bigger story? By the end of the meeting, Morris had more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. He needed to take a closer look at his role in this unfolding narrative. Judge Morris left Amina's office that day with his mind whirling. The conversation had revealed much more than he expected, and as he walked back to his car, he couldn't help but replay their exchange. He had started out with one goal: to understand the broader context of Amina's work, to see if he could validate the concerns she had raised in the courtroom. But now, after hearing her speak so passionately about the need for a shift in wildlife protection policies, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was witnessing something much larger than a simple legal case. For days after the meeting, Morris found himself thinking about Amina's words. His usual routine, reviewing case files, preparing rulings, felt mundane and detached in comparison to the scope of the issues she was grappling with. She wasn't just fighting for a single project or animal species. She was advocating for an entirely new framework of environmental law, one that took into account the urgency of climate change, the fragmentation of habitats, and the role humans played in both creating and solving the problem. The realization that the legal system he had been upholding might be contributing to a cycle of environmental degradation began to weigh heavily on him. The more Morris reflected, the clearer it became that Amina wasn't simply a defendant trying to justify her actions. She was a pioneer, working on the front lines of a movement that could, if successful, change the way the United States approached environmental protection on a federal level. Morris began to see the case in a new light. Amina wasn't just a person trying to sidestep the law. She was challenging it to keep pace with the world's evolving environmental crisis. She was on the cutting edge of scientific research, using her expertise to push for policies that would ensure the survival of species and ecosystems for generations to come. That night, as he sat in his office reviewing case files, Morris found himself increasingly disillusioned with the rigid structure of the law. For so long, he had thought of his role as simple: apply the law as written and make the system work. But now, after hearing Amina's argument, he couldn't help but wonder whether the law itself needed to evolve. Was it his job to enforce outdated rules, or was it his responsibility to question them when they no longer served the greater good? His next steps were uncertain, but one thing was becoming clear. He could no longer look at environmental issues as just another case to rule on. The stakes were too high. The world, as Amina had pointed out, was changing rapidly, and perhaps in some small way, so too could the law. Morris decided to take a risk. He called his colleagues to request a meeting about environmental reform, not knowing where it would lead but certain that the conversation needed to begin. Amina's work had sparked something inside him, a need to reconsider his own role in shaping the future of environmental policy. The courtroom might have been where their paths first crossed, but now, It felt like the true challenge lay beyond the case itself. A few weeks passed, and the case against Amina Johnson seemed to linger in Judge Morris's thoughts. The more he considered it, the more he realized that his decision could have far-reaching implications, not just for Amina, but for the broader debate about how the law should address environmental issues in the face of climate change and habitat destruction. Morris's meeting with his colleagues had been a turning point. At first, he had hesitated to bring up anything so controversial, but to his surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Several of his peers expressed a growing interest in reforming outdated environmental laws, acknowledging that the legal system was no longer fully equipped to tackle the scale of modern conservation challenges. While the conversation was still in its early stages, Morris sensed a shift, a growing realization that the law itself needed to adapt to an increasingly complex world. But the case before him was still unresolved. Amina Johnson was still facing a fine, and Morris was torn. On one hand, the law had been clear about the violation. She had disrupted a protected area. On the other, Amina's actions weren't born from recklessness. They were driven by a passion for saving species and ecosystems. She wasn't acting outside the law for the sake of personal gain. She was trying to make a case for the law's evolution. In the days leading up to the hearing, Morris spent hours reflecting on the larger issues at play. He reached out to environmental scientists, conservationists, and legal experts, seeking their perspectives on how laws could be updated to better protect wildlife. Many of them echoed Amina's sentiments, explaining how regulations that had worked in the past were increasingly unable to account for the complexities of today's environmental landscape. For the first time in his career, Morris felt a true sense of urgency. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom was filled with anticipation. Amina stood at the front again, but this time, her posture seemed less defensive. She had done what she could to make her case, and now, it was up to Judge Morris to decide whether he would uphold the fine, or something much bigger. Morris sat at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, feeling the weight of his responsibility. He could follow the letter of the law and impose the fine, reinforcing the status quo, or he could consider the long-term impact of Amina's work, the policy she was advocating for, and the role he might play in supporting that change. The choice seemed impossible, but in that moment, Morris realized that it wasn't just about Amina or her case. It was about something more profound: the future of the environment, the laws that were meant to protect it, and his own role in shaping that future. He stood up, walked toward the bench, and prepared to make a decision that might change the course of both his career and the nation's approach to conservation. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Morris stood, a sense of finality in the air. Amina was seated at the front, her expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She had no way of knowing what the judge had decided, but she had prepared herself for whatever the outcome would be. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case had become bigger than just a fine. It had become a test of how the law could evolve to meet the demands of a changing world. Morris paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the room. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on him. He had spent countless hours reflecting, consulting with experts, and considering the broader implications of his ruling. He knew that what he was about to say would not only affect Amina's future, but could also shape the ongoing conversation about environmental law in the United States. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Morris began, his voice steady but filled with conviction, "after careful consideration, I have come to the conclusion that this case is not as simple as it appears. Your work, and the work of many like you, is challenging the very framework of environmental protection in this country. I cannot, in good conscience, simply issue a fine without acknowledging the larger context." Amina's heart raced. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she could feel the tension building. While the law as it stands does provide protections, it is increasingly clear that those laws are not keeping pace with the reality of our environmental crisis. What you are advocating for, research, policy reform, and broader protections, is not a mere disruption of the system. It is a necessary evolution. I believe that your actions, though technically a violation, are in service of a greater cause." Amina's eyes widened as she processed the words. She had hoped for an understanding, but she hadn't expected this kind of recognition. The judge wasn't just accepting her argument. He was validating the urgency behind it. "Therefore," Morris continued, "I am dismissing the fine in this case. I also encourage you to continue your work, as difficult as it may be, and to keep pushing for the reforms that are desperately needed. The laws that govern our wildlife and natural resources must change, and I believe that you are playing a key role in that change." Amina felt a rush of relief and gratitude, but there was something else too, a sense of responsibility. The judge's words were a challenge as much as they were a victory. She wasn't just being let off the hook. She was being called to continue her fight for a better, more sustainable future. As she left the courtroom that day, Amina knew that her work had just become more urgent than ever. But she also knew that, in some small way, she had just begun to reshape the future of environmental protection. And now, thanks to Judge Morris's decision, she wasn't alone in that fight. For the judge, the case had ended, but the impact it had on him was just beginning. He walked away from the courtroom that day not only having ruled on a case, but also with a renewed sense of purpose, to ensure that the law, at least in his courtroom, would never remain static in the face of pressing change. The future of conservation, like the future of law itself, would be shaped by those bold enough to challenge it. And in that, he had found a new path forward.